signed another treaty in 1868 when the United States Peace Commission went out to all of the Western nations and signed peace treaties with them. This is the Northern Cheyenne Treaty with the United States government, 1868. Remember the 1851 treaty, how that started. Remember what happened to the Cheyenne people between 1851 and 1868. Total war started by the U.S. government. Article 1. From this day forward, peace between the parties to this treaty shall forever continue. The government of the United States desires peace, and its honor is hereby pledged to keep it. The Indians desire peace, and they hereby pledge their honor to maintain it. This was the last treaty that the Cheyenne people and the U.S. government signed. Article 2, the Indians, party to this treaty, hereby agree to accept for their permanent home some portion of the country set apart and designated as their permanent land in treaties earlier, entered into them between them and the United States at Medicine Lodge Creek. The Northern Cheyenne and Arapaho Indians do hereby relinquish, release, and surrender to the United States all right, claim, and interest in, and to all territory outside the above-mentioned land, except the right to roam and hunt while game shall be found, and they do solemnly agree that they will not build any permanent homes outside of said reservations, and that within 1 year to date they will attach themselves either around Medicine Lodge Creek, and so on and so on. And then it goes on about the Crow Indians at Fort Laramie. Of course, I'm not really trying to shock anybody by saying, look at what the U.S. promised and didn't keep. We know the U.S. doesn't keep its promises. The important thing is that legally, through these treaties, the U.S. agreed to certain things, and that those agreements are part of the supreme law of your country, of the United States. And that by signing a treaty, the U.S. has recognized the nationhood of Indian nations. You don't sign a treaty with a group of people. You don't sign a treaty with a tribe. You don't sign a treaty with a community. You don't sign a treaty with a band. Nations sign treaties. And these treaties say nations. It says the Cheyenne Nation. And the Supreme Court ruled in the Cherokee case that Indian nations are nations like any other nations in the world to the U.S. legal system. And it said that the U.S. must treat them as any other nations in the world. And that Supreme Court decision still stands. It's never been changed at all. And today, the Bureau of Indian Affairs administers every minute of our lives. And the Bureau of Indian Affairs of the United States government, signs leases with American Metal Climax and other companies for our land. And we get 14 cents, 16 cents an acre for coal, while those companies totally destroy our land forever. AMAC's most serious crime, then, to us, is colonization. AMAC is a party in complicity with the U.S. government in colonization. And I believe that there is no more hideous thing to do to human beings as nations of people than to colonize them. You take away their lives, and at the same time, you completely degrade them as people. And on top of that colonization, AMAC is a partner in complicity with the U.S. government in genocide. which is the most serious crime against humanity. And believes that it is all right to do those things, believes that it can get away with those things. The complicity I'm talking about, the government of the United States every year does studies of the effects of colonization, the effects of water pollution, the effects of air pollution, the effects of everything it does to us. And it documents these things beautifully. And every year you can read those reports and cry and think. The government puts out good reports, which it does. It has beautiful statistics. Every year, 1930 in Oklahoma, they brought up people to Congress, congressmen from Oklahoma, to say that the Cherokee people were starving to death. And the congressman said, "Do you really mean starving to death?" And the guy said, "Sure, I mean starving to death, and here are my government statistics." 1930. 1950, a report on the Cherokee Nation in Oklahoma, starving to death. "Do you really mean starving to death?" "Sure, here are the government statistics." 1950. 1964, the Kennedy report, Indian people starving to death. The Policy Review Commission, 1975, 1976, Indian people starving to death. The government knows what it's doing. The government knows the effects of these companies. The government knows the effects of its colonization. This is the U.S. government's report on reservation and resource development and protection of Indian lands, done by a full Senate Committee on Indian Affairs. Now, two of the people who put together this report for the U.S. government, one was Peter McDonald, chairman of the Navajo Nation. Chairman of the Navajo Nation means puppet of the U.S. government. What the hell is a nation that it has a chairman? You don't have a chairman of a nation, you have a chairman of a corporation. And this man is the puppet. And this man is a millionaire. This is a Navajo. Peter McDonald, who heads up this government report, is a millionaire. And the Navajo people are starving to death, and the U.S. government puts out reports that the Navajo people are starving to death. And then it puts out in here, in this report, the conclusions are that the Indian people, of course, cannot keep their resources for their own use because the energy situation in the country is too bad. And of course, they don't have any real legal right to their own land and their own resources because the country may need it. And of course, the U.S. government can move in at any time and take those resources. That's what this report says. 1976, this came out 4 months ago. But you saw what that treaty said. Another man involved in this government report is Bill Keeler. He was president of the Cherokee Nation from 1951 to 1976, appointed president of the Cherokee Nation by President Truman. While he was president of the Cherokee Nation, he also became chairman of the board of Phillips Petroleum Corporation. And what he learned stabbing his own people in the back, Phillips moved into Venezuela and is doing the same thing to Indians in Venezuela today. And this man was just convicted of contributing $2 million illegally to Nixon's campaign fund, this Keeler, and he was fined $2,000. He was involved in this government report. It is a deliberate policy of the U.S. government to pretend that we are not nations of people, and in fact, we are not people at all, and to make everybody accept that. And these coal companies and these energy companies are not separate from the U.S. government. They are the same people. And this white vigilante group called Custer's Avengers that Charles Sentner, was a member of and started AMAX Corporation with its first mine, is still operating on the Cheyenne Reservation today. Today it's called the Mod Squad, and it's a white vigilante organization. And it's exactly like Custer's Avengers, and its purpose is exactly the same thing: to drive Indians out so that those companies, that AMAX company that was doing that same thing in 1880, can take over that land and steal those resources. Thank you. Do I stay for questions?
If there are some questions from the grand juries, we'll take them now.
What is the situation with respect to a recognition of the Indian nations by either United Nations as a body or other nation states this time?
Our work at the United Nations has like just begun. And what is going on in the United Nations right now is a battle, an absolute battle between third world forces and U.S. forces. And you can see this battle every day. You can see what the U.S. is able to do when Puerto Rico comes before the United Nations. The U.S. goes to countries and says, if you vote for Puerto Rico, we are going to shoot you. What they said was, we will consider that an act of direct aggression against the U.S. and take appropriate action. And those countries know what kind of weapons, real bombs and economic weapons, that the U.S. government has, and knows that it's willing to use them. So we have a hard battle in the United Nations. Right now, the Organization of African Unity is working with us very well, and other organizations of third world people, and many African countries, and all real liberation organizations in the world are in solidarity with us.
Excuse me. I'm terribly confused of the legal relationship between U.S. because it seemed, now when they entered into treaties, they addressed them as nations. But when they have relations with them, economic relations with them, it's obvious that they're not treated in that fashion. Does AMAX pay taxes for its, the rights that it's been granted it to mine within the sovereign nation of the Cheyenne Nation, for instance? Who determines what will be the price for the raw materials that are mined on Indian territories? The sovereign representatives of the nation, as nations do, is that determined outside of the body of the nation by the U.S.? Is it a reservation or is it a game preserve? Where people are an endangered species. It's terribly confusing. Yeah.
The U.S. legal system, as far as we are concerned, is just one more weapon. And what has happened in the 1870s, after the 1868 treaties in the West, the U.S. made a total war against Indians in the West. And I mean a total war in that they were using germ warfare, they were using smallpox-infested blankets, and they had a deliberate government policy to kill all of our food supply. That's why the buffalo are gone, because of a deliberate policy of the U.S. government to kill the buffalo so that we would die. And that's in the record. So by 1870s and 80s, the Indian population in this country was down to 300,000. 300,000. And we were at our lowest point at that time. And at that time, in 1871, the U.S. government passed a congressional act saying that it would no longer consider Indian nations as nations and would no longer enter into treaties with Indian nations. But it also said that it would honor the treaties that it had already signed, because it had to say that, because those treaties are the supreme law of the land. And so it took that congressional act and told itself that that means that we are not nations, because Congress doesn't treat us as nations anymore. So if I don't treat you as a human being anymore, has no bearing on whether or not you are a human being. It only has bearing on how I'm treating you. It doesn't make you legally a non-human being. And if the U.S. government passes a congressional act that says we will treat the Mexican people as turtles, it does not make the Mexican people turtles. It only means that the U.S. will treat the Mexican people as turtles. So that's the legal setup. It's strictly a weapon. But from that congressional act, the U.S. went on to pass other congressional acts. And it's part of the policy to destroy us. In 1884, passed the Allotment Act, which said, well, these Indians are not vanishing quickly enough, and they're still being nations, and they're still acting communally and collectively. And this act in 1884 was the Allotment Act, which said that Indian people could not hold land collectively, that only individual Indian families could own land. And this is a new thing, because they never passed congressional acts before saying what Indians could or could not do. Whether or not a nation of people could own or not own land, they never passed that before. But after 1871, when they said that they would not treat us as nations, they pretended that that meant we weren't nations. So their next congressional act says you can't do something. You can't own land communally. And that didn't work either. We kept on owning our land communally, legally pretending that we weren't, and we did it anyway. And then, 1924, we still hadn't vanished, we still hadn't dispersed, we still hadn't become white. The government passed the Citizenship Act, saying, well, you are not nations of people. You're U.S. citizens. That was the Citizenship Act. But that doesn't make us not our own people. If the U.S., again, passed a congressional act tomorrow that everybody in Mexico was a U.S. citizen, then it's up to the U.S. to treat all of those people as citizens. But it's not up to those people to be citizens of the U.S. or not. It's just up to the U.S. to treat them like citizens. It doesn't make them not citizens of their own nations. It still didn't work. We still considered ourselves nations of people. We still didn't vanish. In 1934, they passed the IRA, the Indian Reorganization Act, another congressional act. And that act said that we could have our own government. And this is the answer to the second part of your question. That we could have our own government under a tribal chairman, which is a company name, and a tribal council, if we did democratic elections supervised by the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And the Bureau of Indian Affairs would have and does exercise absolute and total control over any decision of that tribal council on any reservation. If the tribal chairman is democratically elected and is somebody that the Bureau of Indian Affairs does not like, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, by its own authority, can remove him immediately, and they do that. If it does not like a tribal judge, it can remove that tribal judge, no matter what Indian body has appointed that tribal judge, or a tribal councilman. And in that process, and this is a puppet organization, this tribal council. It's not the people that are really freely elected by that nation, whatever nation. It's the people that the government puts in every case. And they're government people. In that situation, the United States Bureau of Indian Affairs declared that it was the trustee of Indian land. Not the trustee of Indian people, but the trustee of Indian land, with the reasoning that we were too childlike and simple to administer our own land. And so it administers our land. So American Metal Climax, to get leases of land from the Cheyenne people, does not go to the Cheyenne people. It goes to the Bureau of Indian Affairs. And the Bureau of Indian Affairs decides the terms of the lease, and then the Bureau of Indian Affairs decides what price to sell the coal. And then it takes that to its tribal council and says, do you agree with this? Right, you agree with that. And the tribal council says, okay. Or if they decide, as the Cheyenne Tribal Council has decided, wait a minute, we don't want our land destroyed. We don't really agree with all of this. We're going to stop this whole process. Then the BI plays games and says, well, okay, you can stop it. You have to take it through our courts. You have to go through U.S. courts to find out whether you can really stop us from leasing your land or not. So that's like, you have to ask our permission whether or not you can decide whether or not we can lease your land away. Strict colonization. Nothing less. That's the system.
Every day on the way to work, when I drive to work and drive home, I hear Amex commercials. They usually begin with, here's Loretta Lynn for Amex Coal, and she sings a cute little song. This is on the Washington Post station, by the way. And she sings a little song about the way to fill tomorrow is to learn from yesterday, and the promise is in people who can find a better way.
That's true.
And then a friendly gentleman tells us all about coal and says that at Amex Coal Company, we're proud to be mining energy for today and tomorrow. With the ability of a company like Amex to speak with such power through the accomplices, the media, what chance is there to challenge whether or not Amex is really a better way?
I think we have to realize that Amex and companies like them are masters at misusing language. I mean, this guy Sentner was in Custer's Avengers, and that's a use of language that tricks people in the first place. But what that reminds me of is language that Amex now uses. On the Cheyenne Reservation, Amex itself doesn't have very many leases, but an outfit called Meadowlark Farms has many leases. Meadowlark Farms is Amex, Strip Mining Corporation, but they name it Meadowlark Farms. And their brochures say that they are farming coal, because they know people have heard about strip mining. So they're not strip mining, they're farming coal. And these big destroying machines are plows that farm coal. Now, the chairman of the board of Amex is the man who invented the phrase, the family that prays together stays together. He invented that. And he is the boss of the American Christian Laymen's Association, which teaches us all to pray together and stay together and not worry about what Meadowlark Farms might be doing with its farms in the West. What they call on Indian reservations, what these companies and the U.S. government call the ground that the coal is under, is not ground. They don't call it ground. They don't call it land. They call it the overburden. And they talk about how to effectively remove the overburden. And they're talking about our land, and they're calling it the overburden. It's a burden to farm this coal, and they have to remove the burden, and so on. They're masters at using language to do that. And that goes to a serious problem in this country, because the government uses this kind of language. They're talking about sterilization, Connie Uri and I earlier. And the whole idea of sterilization sounds so clean and so clinical to so many people. I think the only way to answer the question is that more people have to rely on themselves to teach themselves and to teach each other what is actually going on, and then take action on what is going on. Or if we learn about all of this stuff that the government does and then we just get mad about it, well, Rockefeller and this guy who runs the American Christian Laymen's Association, they just giggle, you know. we're sitting back in our living room. The action needs to be taken. That's what changes things.
Jimmy, I had some experience in East Kentucky and West Virginia against strip mining on one hand, where the landowners and the people were conscious of what was happening to their land, and on the other hand, the United Mine Workers Union and the guys who were actually working saw the struggle against strip mining as possibly taking jobs away from them. They felt like there was a contradiction. And since we moved back to this area, we got involved in labor struggles on one hand, and on the other hand, we see the black community in the district being pushed out of their land, so to speak. And we've seen over and over again this contradiction or seeming contradiction arise between the liberation struggles, national liberation struggles on one hand, which have a land consciousness to them, and on the other hand, the labor struggles where the working class is fighting back against exploitation. And I was wondering if you could discuss how you see any alliances being built to unite these two aspects of what it seems to be the same struggle against the same enemy, but where people seem to have a different consciousness about that struggle.
We even have that situation in miniature with strip mining in Black Mesa today. There are Indian men who drive the strip mining machines and strip mine their own villages where they grew up because they don't see any choice but to do that. And their elders are sitting there watching their village being destroyed by that strip mining machine. But people feel so hopeless because of their situation that they don't see a choice. And I think that's one of the problems of a lot of people in this country, in the U.S. People feel like, well, we can't really take over. We can't really have our own land. We can't really be in control of our own lives. So what we got to do is talk about a better wage or talk about a better deal when we're strip mining. And I'm not sure of specific ways to get over that hurdle. One of the things that we're able to talk about with a lot of people is that strip mining in the West is going to be a serious thing. By 1985, the West, according to government reports that are in this document that I'm turning over to the grand jury today, one of their reports says that by 1985, the huge majority of coal in this country will be mined and the supply will come from the West. And if that happens, that doesn't just affect the Indians there. It doesn't just affect the West. What they're going to do if they strip mine that land is destroy the water table. Average rainfall out there in the Cheyenne country is 10 inches a year, which is not enough to reclaim. You cannot reclaim that land once it's strip mined. And the water goes away. Now those coal beds act as what are called aquifers, which means the water is like in drain pipes in those coal. The seams of the coal act as pipes, and that underground water supply is there. So when you tap those seams, that water goes away, and there's nothing on top to hold any water. And the water runs, the rainfall runs the wrong way. It runs down the strip mining path into nowhere. And the pollution in the water, the pollution in the air, and the destruction of that water table affects the whole continent. You can't do something in one part of the continent and not affect the other part. One of the immediate effects is going to be that that's going to seriously deplete the grain and the beef production in this country. This country right now has huge amounts of grain and beef. But by 1985, it won't have, because it won't have the ecology to support that grain and beef. But the pollution itself is getting the degree that people think, well, we're all going to die tomorrow from pollution. In fact, we can stop it. That's everybody's problem. That's everybody's together. We're our own nations of people, but we know very well that if the river is polluted here in the U.S. country, and it goes through our country, they're drinking poison just like everybody else. So we're not going to let them pollute it over there either. So we do have a common thing to fight. But on top of that, I think we have to start talking to everybody about why do we think that these companies and this government has the right to do any of these things? I don't think this government has the right to do anything. I don't think it's a legal government. I think it's an illegal settler regime government.
In listening to the situation of Native Americans here in North America, I see a lot of similarities, very close historical parallels to the situation in South Africa, where the indigenous population was gradually moved further out of the lands, finally into very small enclosures of land called Bantustans. And in fact, I understand the inspiration for the Bantustans really came from Otto, which was the route on establishing reservations here in the United States. And recently what's happened is international pressure is mounted against the South African regime. It has attempted to promote a policy of granting limited independence to some Bantustans, and it's used some of the traditional tribal chiefs as a front for this effort. One specific case is the Transkei last year, where they attempted to launch a phony Transkei independence plan, which still essentially allow them to control the economy and the politics of that area. I'm wondering, in your efforts to get international support for recognition of Indian nations here in the United States, have you seen similar moves to promote the same type of arrangement as yet? Have you seen this type of response from the United States government that's willing to use perhaps the tribal leaders and so forth, and grant a limited recognition to some of the nations using the same, I guess this time reversing it in the South African model?
I think the government began that idea in the organization, but not quite so as with Transkei. But it's not what the government is trying to do with the Navajo reservation.